Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's event, An Allied Approach to De-risking the Tech Supply Chain. My name is Dave Schulman, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub, which devises allied solutions to the greatest global challenges posed by China's rise, leveraging the China expertise at the Atlantic Council across our 16 programs and centers. Aspects of China's global economic practices, including the use of economic coercion, state subsidies, and tariff implementation, have made it increasingly difficult for foreign companies to rely on Chinese state-sponsored enterprises within their supply chain. In response, the United States and its transatlantic allies are looking to diversify and secure new tech supply chains through friendshoring, among other policies. Last year, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen outlined a framework for Europe's greater economic independence to de-risk from Europe's over-reliance on China for critical materials, by building out tools for new outbound investment and stronger export controls. The European Commission has set a target of mobilizing 43 billion euros in policy-driven investment for the semiconductor industry in Europe by 2030, and a large majority of European companies are looking at implementing regionalization of supply chains in the near future by forming closer relationships with other European partners. Similarly, the United States has implemented measures such as the Department of Commerce's export control rules on advanced computing and semiconductors, and an executive order on outbound investment screening. The U.S.'s Bipartisan Chips and Science Act of 2022 made strengthening U.S. manufacturing and increased nearshoring efforts a national security priority. As part of President Biden's Investing in America agenda, the U.S. Department of Commerce has demonstrated strong interest in funding small supply chain projects aimed at elevating U.S. competitiveness in key technology areas such as semiconductors. However, there remain differing perceptions between public and private actors in the United States, in Europe, as well as other countries on the nature of such risks and the coercive potential of Chinese economic activities. These differences have inhibited the formulation of a coherent narrative that would be conducive to an allied strategy to restructuring tech supply chain dependencies away from China. The differing risk perceptions stem from a mix of national interests, security concerns, and commercial considerations among various stakeholders. Today, we've gathered an incredible group of experts to delve into this issue and spur collective action between the United States and allied governments and private sector partners to de-risking the tech supply chain. Our expected keynote speaker, Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Technology and National Security, Tarun Chhabra, is unfortunately unable to join us due to a travel mishap, but we're still set for a robust discussion on these critical topics. To lead that discussion, I'd like to hand things over now to Atlantic Council Geoeconomics Center non-resident fellow, Jeremy Mark, who will be moderating today's event. Jeremy, in addition to being a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council, is a specialist in political, economic, and financial issues related to Asia and Africa. With the Geoeconomic Center, he writes on issues related to the U.S.-China relationship and developing country debt. He worked for the International Monetary Fund as a communications specialist for more than 2 decades, including as an advisor and speechwriter to the IMF management team. Take it away, Jeremy.
Thank you so much, Dave, and welcome, everybody. Welcome to those of you who are online watching us around the world. Look, we're really happy to do this event today. We're sorry that we've had to adjust our agenda on the fly. We've actually also lost one of our panelists, Cleet Willems, who was unfortunately unable to attend today. But we have a very strong panel. 2 here, one in New Zealand. I'll introduce them in a moment. But because we've lost the segment of our event that was going to delve into U.S. policy and the issues underlying the supply chain policy shifts, I thought it would be useful to take a couple of minutes and lay out a quick introduction, which we can then use to help frame our discussion. I think Dave touched on, should we say, the geopolitical overlay, which is really driving these policy changes. I want to talk a bit about the supply chains themselves. In essence, the emergence of high technology and high-tech manufacturing in Asia has essentially turned that part of the world into the centerpiece of the global economy and a geopolitical flashpoint. And we're talking really about semiconductors, both at the cutting edge of the technology as well as the workhorse semiconductors of older generations that still are driving so much of the global economy and our daily lives. We're talking about supply chains that have essentially grown up over the past 30 years. They involve multiple countries, literally trillions of dollars of capital investment, and a vast range of inputs that are sourced from around the world, as far away as Ukraine was a centerpiece for certain specialty chemicals before the Russian invasion, for example. As this supply chain has developed, geopolitics has not really been a central element of the decision-making that the industry has made over the years. And so in a sense, what you have is this interrelated a set of manufacturing hubs that have grown up without a great deal of thought to political ramifications. And the administration now, the Biden administration, in attempting to address some of the key political sensitivities and vulnerabilities that have emerged in recent years centered on semiconductors and other technology, is starting to look into how this web of manufacturing and I would add this web of profit-making activities may have to be reoriented. And Dave touched on, shall we say, the sort of the direct response to China already in terms of export controls and in terms of limitations on investment, outbound investment. A lot of that has unfolded in a series of decisions made through Commerce Department in the last 2 years. And we can get into that if necessary, but suffice it to say that there are significant restrictions on the sophistication of chips that can be sold to China, as well as restrictions on semiconductor manufacturing equipment that can be sold to China. At the same time, the U.S. Has, as Dave mentioned, pursued an effort to, shall we say, revitalize semiconductor manufacturing and other aspects of the supply chain here in the U.S. Because the U.S. has been largely focused in recent years on very specific, important, specialized aspects of semiconductor production, for example, chip design, and certain specialty chemicals and other materials. Congress passed the Chips and Science Act in 2022, which is intended to provide grants and loans to stimulate semiconductor manufacturing. And as of last month, there had been roughly $30 billion of grants given to several companies, including specifically Intel, Samsung Electronics, and Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corp. The latter two were rapidly building up semiconductor manufacturing bases here in the U.S., largely in Arizona and Texas. Other American companies have also received investments here, but this is really just the very beginning of a process to try and restructure the supply chains that right now run very much through China. And I think the best way to talk about that would be to introduce our panel and turn to some specific questions, and you don't have to listen to me anymore. We have three really excellent speakers today. Joining me to my left, far left, your right, and I really don't know what to say for you on the screen. Frances Burwell is with us. Fran is a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center and also a senior director at McClarty Associates. She is our go-to person on everything related to Europe. Then immediately to my left is Claire Chu, who is a non-resident fellow at the Global China Hub with Dave. She is also a senior China analyst at Janes and a principal in Janes's geoeconomics threat intelligence practice. And finally, online, joining us is Christy Xu, who is director of the Taiwan ASEAN Studies Center at the Zhonghua Institution for Economic Research in Taiwan. Christy is joining us today from New Zealand, where it's well past midnight already, and we are doubly grateful, Christy, for you joining us for all of these reasons, but particularly for the expertise that you always bring to Atlantic Council events. So thank you for being here today. What I'd like to do is start with Claire, because we're talking about China, we're talking about how the U.S. is responding to China and Chinese policies, and I think it's only fair that we start by laying out not just how China views things, but China's role in the global economy from the point of view of high technology. So, Claire, I was wondering if you could, in essence, sort of talk about China's response to U.S. policy and how they are viewing the landscape at this point, please.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, from China's point of view, just to start with the overall mindset, this is very unfair to China, right? Everything that's happened in the past few years. China feels that the U.S. is using human rights, is using environment, and all these other sorts of labels to further national security objectives. There are accusations continuously of the U.S. expanding, always expanding its definition of national security, right? The small yard, high fence, the yard keeps getting bigger and bigger. And so I think this is what we've been hearing from the Chinese side for a while, and will continue to. But also in terms of actual responses, I don't think we'll see very much this year to change from the Chinese side. I think there's going to be a wait-and-see period until the end of the year. With that said, I think Chinese officials and experts do realize that the current trend of decoupling, de-risking, at least from the U.S. and the West, isn't going to likely to change anytime soon. The trajectory has been set, right? We're not going to roll this back. We saw with the Trump administration is really an introduction of a slew of existing but also new regulatory and policy tools. We saw new uses of certain presidential powers, and with the Biden administration, really continuation of these actions. And we went from this suite of restrictive policies set by the previous administration to the continuation of those with the addition of new self-reinforcing, development-focused policies under this current administration, right? So further investment in innovation, in talent and whatnot. And so again, China recognizes this, and that they themselves are going to have to move forward and continue to bolster China's supply chain and continue fighting for tech sovereignty, for R&D independence, so on and so forth, as opposed to trying to necessarily hit back from China to the U.S. But with that said, China also has imposed some restrictive policies. We've seen some bans on certain imports, gallium, for example, 2023. We've seen some more punitive actions taken on U.S. companies like Micron. So China is signaling, that it is very much has the same power, or wants to say it has the same power as the U.S. to fight back. But at the same time, we're seeing a lot of, again, self-reinforcing measures from China. And that includes everything from narrative development, right? There's China, especially the global south, this idea of, again, digital sovereignty, idea of, I guess, every country being able to, I guess, relatively control its own digitization journey. China's working with a lot of countries, say Kenya with AI, emerging markets, emerging high-tech economies, and trying to work with, again, this whole slew of countries that could potentially agree with China on some of the supply chain girdling measures. But also in terms of reinforcement, there is big focus on youth and on talent in China right now. I think last year there was a new plan for youth talent, science and technology development. China realizes that its workforce is really key to the future of innovation. So we're seeing everything from directives to science and technology institutions, universities, to promote young researchers at a faster pace, to put younger researchers in charge of more independent research projects, also just to make their lives easier, removing administrative burdens from university researchers, making forms easier to fill out, right? Removing some of the administrative tasks, giving them more vacation time, and just really trying to invest in that subset of China's economy and China's workforce, but also a lot of regulatory bodies like China Securities Regulatory Commission, for example, has been very active in building up its its tech sector. So we've seen, I think it was early last year, a new restriction, reportedly a new restriction on non-strategic sectors seeking to IPO, right? So like the Baijiu industry, education industry were prohibited, again, reportedly from fundraising on the Shenzhen Shanghai exchanges. And this was intended to redirect the funds that would have been available to these companies to emerging high-tech strategic sectors and manufacturing, right? So these are some of the powers that China has. We're also seeing the increasing use, the central bank, of certain monetary policies and tools. They're looking to banks, to insurers, to potentially guarantee investments made by venture capital, private equity firms, science technology spaces. Last year, there were, I think, 7 new funds in science, technology, and innovation that were set up in order to invest in the Shenzhen or Shanghai's new STAR, or Tech and Innovation Board, across other boards as well. So really just a lot of actions taken internally to encourage talent development and upskilling, but also to encourage investment and development, and also I think some forward-looking measures to buy supplies and buy products. We're seeing that with ASML, for example, last year, in order to guard against future de-risking or decoupling measures that will inevitably be taken by the U.S. regardless of administration.
ASML being the major Dutch manufacturer of semiconductor manufacturing equipment,
Yes.
Which is a linchpin to the global industry.
Right.
I'm going to ask you a follow-up in a second. I realize what I failed to do in my introduction is to tell the audience that you're welcome to submit your questions, and you can do that at www.askac.com, AskAC being solid. The quick follow-up question. China is absolutely deeply embedded in technology supply chains. It is an essential source of manufacturing and manufacturing know-how for the industry around the world. It's also a very, very important market and source of profits for the industry. Do you think that Beijing, to a degree, regards itself as somewhat immune to de-risking because of its central role?
I don't think that Beijing views itself as immune. I think it's seen some of the impact of certain restrictions that have been enacted so far. But Beijing is also very opportunistic and very scrappy, right? So even, for example, in terms of some of the Chinese researchers having been cut off from some research and visa opportunities and funding opportunities in the U.S., when the war with Ukraine broke out, even though Huawei in Russia technically closed its consumer and its corporate sales organizations, entities, they actually, I think, almost tripled their staff and their R&D facilities in Russia, and they took advantage of the outflow of multinational and international tech companies and hired a lot of these, really smart, like IT, digital talents, both to come to China, but also to build out its 5 facilities, R&D facilities, and work in 5G, cloud tech, a lot of emerging technologies. But also, really, China has its whole supply chain approach when it comes to technology. So not just manufacturing and processing, but everything from mining and materials, but also R&D, of course, a lot of collaboration, trying to seek out patents in very key industries, aluminum, steel, and whatnot, all the way through, again, of course, manufacturing and then consumer sales.
Great. I'm going to turn to Christy now, because I think that you can offer us crucial perspectives on this topic from the point of view of the manufacturing superpowers that have emerged along the Pacific Rim, Taiwan in particular, South Korea, and to a lesser extent, Japan. Christy, I'm just curious, from your point of view, how are you seeing both the Taiwan government and the other key governments in East Asia reacting over time to the policies that the Biden administration has been putting in place over the last 3+ years?
Yes, thank you very much for the question, and also thank you very much for having me here. I think that is a very good question, because if we look back all the past years since U.S.-China trade war started, and we have the Trump administration as well as Biden administration. And both administrations actually target, as you mentioned, Taiwan and South Korea for a number of measures, including the relocation of supply chain. Also, we were also targeted by this export control, asking to be in collaboration with U.S. policy. And therefore, of course, for Taiwan as well as for South Korea, because U.S. is not only the most important trading partner, but also the most important security partner for both of us. And therefore, the government has to be responding by responding to the policy. And therefore, in the past few years, for Taiwanese government, they have also passed similar policy or similar legislation trying to encourage our industry to cope with this new trend. And therefore, in the past years, we do see this company having adjusted their trading strategy as well as their investment strategy. By investment strategy, I have to say that this is the first time for more than 2 decades that Taiwan right now consider more geopolitical tension, more geopolitical consideration than just cost. And therefore, under this kind of scenario, this kind of strategy, right now, they kind of adjust their investment going to China. So back in 2010, China accounted for around 85% of our total outbound investment. That means every $100 we invested overseas, and $85 went to China. However, since 2018, China only accounted for about 30% of our total outbound investment. And last year, 2023, China accounted for less than 20%. So in the meantime, Taiwan has increased or diversified their supply chain beyond China. In the past few years in Southeast Asia and also India in South Asia have been a major destination for receiving the supply chain invested by Taiwan into their country. And I have to mention that Taiwan also follows suit the Trump's administration's reshoring strategy as well as Biden's strategy to call back manufacturing back home to the U.S. And therefore, Taiwan's investment going to the U.S. also increased significantly. Last year, TSMC is mentioned, Taiwan's the world's largest chip maker. TSMC alone invested $9 billion in Arizona for its first fab, and it announced that it's going to build a second fab as well as third fab. So last year, for the U.S., for the first time in 2 decades, became the largest destination for our outbound investment. I think that kind of trend will continue, meaning Taiwanese company working with our government as well as responding the global geopolitical landscape, also U.S. policy. They try to diversify their investment as well as their supply chain. And therefore, I think that China will continue to be very important, but will account for about 1/3 of our total investment in the next few years. Southeast Asia is very important, and while the other 40% may very likely go to more advanced countries that include the U.S. and also include the European member state. Just remember that TSMC also started their investment project in Dresden, Germany. So Taiwanese companies are very much more diversified, and that is the same case if we shift Taiwan to South Korea. South Korea, as far as I know, they also actively responding to this changing global economy by investing more directly in the U.S. But South Korea has another different aspect compared with Taiwan because they invested heavily in China, and therefore South Korean government has to balance their relation with China as well as their relation with the U.S. And therefore they try to negotiate with U.S. government to give them more flexibility, maintaining their their position in China. But Taiwan, I would say that because U.S. is our largest client, and therefore for Taiwan, when our companies shift their supply chain from China to places outside China, they are much more willing to cope with that kind of new trend. So this is the changes we have made here in Northeast Asia in the past few years.
Great, thank you. I'd like to ask a quick follow-up since you're talking about the shift of direct investment out of China. In the last few months, we have seen the U.S. emerge as Taiwan's largest export market, replacing China. This is the first time since 2003 this has taken place. And I'm curious, do you regard this as a significant shift, should we say a structural change as a result of these policies now being put in place? Or is this simply a function of China's current economic slowdown and somewhat reduced demand from Taiwan, or is it a combination of both?
Yeah, I think there are different aspects to answer that question. It was more of a mixture of Taiwan's policy trying to encourage Taiwan industry, Taiwan exporters to diversify their market, and also because of the U.S. policy, as well as the market-driven necessity for Taiwan company to consider. So in the past few years, because of the U.S.-China trade war, a lot of Taiwanese companies actually conducted home shoring coming back to Taiwan. And therefore, they used to export directly from China to the U.S., for example, and right now they came back to Taiwan and they produce and assemble products in Taiwan and then export from Taiwan to U.S., which increased significantly our export to U.S. That is one thing. Another thing is Taiwan has been benefited from this chip shortage in the past few years, and therefore we have increased our export of chips, including legacy chips as well as advanced chip in the past few years because of this growing demand, especially for this AI application. And therefore, we now export much more chips to other parts of the world. And we also, of course, we continue to export to China, but we also explore much more potentials to other countries. And therefore, while we decrease our export to China down to last year, China accounted for around 35% of our total export, which is the lowest for 20 years. And in the meantime, our export going to the U.S., it was about 17%. So it was not the largest export market yet, but it's right now the second largest export market. I think that kind of trend will continue. So by having this kind of change, that means this restructuring of our export composition, as well as the new demands right now in more advanced country in terms of the AI development and all kinds of need that Taiwan can be a very important supplier.
Great, thank you. Fran, I don't mean to give short shrift to Europe. We've started inevitably with China and Taiwan, but I think it's really important that we bring the European perspective into this at this point, because I think that the U.S. policies have very much had an eye to Europe and Europe's own development of semiconductor manufacturing, et cetera, and clearly we're seeing Europe itself give much greater attention to this. So could you kind of take a few minutes and give us an overview of how Europe fits in?
Sure. I think the first thing to start with, though, is to back up and look a little bit at the place of trade in Europe. Because Europe is traditionally a trading nation or a collection of trading nations. And in fact, when you think about international trade as the share of trade of goods and services in GDP, it's now over 100%. That sounds weird, but it's the way it's measured. For the US, it's under 30%. World Bank Trade Openness Index, the EU is 110%, while the US is 25%. So what this does is that it has created over generations a very different set of domestic political constituencies. There is much more faith in the productivity of trade, in the value of trade in Europe. And therefore, there's reluctance to think about barriers. Of course, some have not done well by trade in Europe, but there are powerful political constituencies, I just have to say the words German car makers, for everyone to understand that this is, for political leaders, restrictions on trade are something that is relatively new in the political lexicon. And in fact, if you look at a map that the European Commission puts up all the time, of where they have trade negotiations, FTA negotiations going on or already accomplished, they have free trade agreements with something like 81 countries around the world. Most of the world, in fact, they either have negotiations or have completed an FTA. Just a few outliers: Russia, China, the United States. India is under negotiation. We were, but we're not now. So I think that is kind of the starting point for where Europe comes from in thinking about this. The other issue that we find is that trade and investment are very closely linked. It often starts out that you do a lot of trading with a partner, and then you invest there because you want to be close to your customers, various supply chain issues, and then trade follows investment. It's estimated now that about 30% of US-EU trade is actually the same companies, like BMW or whatever, sending parts back and forth between its different factories. So it's not, the whole car going back. It's a bunch of different things. And this means that Europe is seeing both trade and investment. So BYD, the electric car maker, is a big investor, is investing in battery plants in the EU. At the same time that the EU has an investigation going on into the subsidies that BYD has received or may have received for its Chinese manufacturing. And at the same time, the EU is cognizant that investments by Chinese companies bring other baggage that they may not welcome. So it's a very complicated relationship, and I think in Europe the discussion is, if I can put it this way, it's a little bit more complicated and a little bit more comprehensive than it is here. But there are many, both in officialdom and out in the public, who see trade as how they have made their living. Having said that, however, I think over the last 10 years, Europe has really become much more aware of the risks. This started very slowly, primarily and to some degree rather impolitely, with the Huawei discussions between the United States under the Trump administration and Europe, where we presented a good case. And it could have been done more diplomatically, but eventually most in Europe started rethinking the fact that they were allowing Huawei to be such a large player. Of course, it helped that Europe had two of its own big players, Nokia and Ericsson, which we don't have. But I think then a series of events happened that really kind of made Europe rethink this. First was the Trump administration, and I don't think that we should forget that some of Europe's economic security strategy, the very origins of it, come from the rather shocked reaction to the tariffs that were put on by the Trump administration and fears of where else it might be, what else might come. Then you had COVID, and you had domestically a breakdown in trade, but also the United States restricting ingredients for vaccination. So I think that this was something, and like us, Europe discovered that they didn't have a whole lot of PPE. So there was a series of things with COVID that made them think, supply chains, maybe we shouldn't just let the companies deal with supply chains. Ukraine has been a major motivator, and although here in this country we see this as primarily I would say, a distant war and a military operation. Europe has taken the brunt of the sanctions imposed on Russia. Because of Ukraine, European energy prices, always high to start with, almost doubled temporarily. They're now back down, but this was really a shocking and very troubling thing for European industry. But it also changed the atmosphere in Europe in a very fundamental way, where before, powerful institutions like the European Commission didn't really worry too much about security. But now that's the name of the game. And that's largely because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And then we have China. And I think there is certainly increasing concern about China and about particularly subsidization in China that allows overcapacity to develop, which are then dumped on the European market. We also have, of course, the impact of the IRA. And here I think that there was a belief that the US would be willing to work together to address some of these issues, but that belief has been shaken. And I think that in particular, I had one European say to me the other day that we know whatever happens in November, we're going to get America first. It's just, do we get mini America first or maxi American first? So I think that, the Europeans are far less naive than they were about the US domestic constituencies. So what's been the EU response? I think first off, we need to understand that the EU thinks of itself as a power with a real affinity for international law. Things should be done in a legal way, and that means to try and make things WTO compliant. And that means you don't often name China, but you say that all countries that meet these criteria have issues and could be a risk to our security. I would take the 5G, the toolkit for 5G cybersecurity. That was one of the first initial steps that the EU took. And if you look at the criteria for a trusted vendor in terms of its closeness with state control, and the record of that state at being hostile to the EU, et cetera, most Chinese companies wouldn't qualify. But that's how it is done in Europe, is to set out criteria rather than saying no to China. And for example, the forced labor regulation is not about Zhenyang, although clearly that falls under the criteria, but it's about anywhere that there is forced labor, should not be in the supply chains of goods that are in the European market. It could even apply to forced labor of, for example, Moldovan women in Bulgaria, and then those would have to be taken off the market. Those products would have to be taken off the market. But we're now facing an implementation issue as well in Europe, and I'll get to that in a minute. But along with things like that, the EU set out a comprehensive set of legislation, most of which is now passed, but is just in the early stages of implementation. So you can call me back up here in a year and we'll see how well it's going. But we have, first off, the CHIPS Act, as you mentioned, subsidies, but focused on first-generation fabs. So there is an intent here to not fund just CHIPS fabs in general, but rather high-tech ones. There also is the Net Zero Act, which provides support for key industries, including chips, decided to be identified as strategic. One of the things the Europeans have done is looked at this shift into industrial policy and where the risk comes from. And it's not just China, but the risk comes from climate change. So a lot of these mechanisms are also useful for products that are essential to the green transition. Wind turbines, et cetera, et cetera. But then that brings up the issue of Chinese overcapacity in green technologies and green products. Solar panels, obviously dominated by Chinese industry, and there's a lot of concern in Europe that wind turbines are going the same way. We also have Critical Raw Materials Act, where the ambition is that the EU will, by I think it's 2040, extract 10% of the critical minerals that it requires. It will process 40%. I believe it processes something like 10% right now. And it will recycle 15%. And I don't think there's any hiding that the European ambition is to become the lead recycler of batteries and other things that have critical minerals in them that can be recovered. We also have a lot more inbound investment. This is done at the national level, and here we have issues with implementation. 22 of the 27 now have inbound investment screening, but they're trying to harmonize that. Also, outbound investment. I want to make one point, which is that when we talk about supply chains in Europe, this is not just about security and resilience. It's also about ambitious environmental and social goals you want to achieve. So we look at the deforestation regulation, forced labor, corporate sustainability, and due diligence. So this feeds into the resilience piece because products going into Europe are going to require increased transparency and monitoring. This is going to be a real challenge for companies, and particularly for SMEs. And I didn't mention CBAM, which is even more when we get into carbon. So I think what we're seeing in the EU, and I think this is reflected in the recent visit of Xi, will leave aside his political ambitions by going to Belgrade and Budapest. But I think in the Paris meeting, you see a toughening EU perspective on China, but one that is still trying to negotiate so that it doesn't blow up in their faces. And what I expect from the investigation on electric vehicles is that we will see tariffs come in after the election that are high enough to make the news cycle, but they won't stop the flow of cars into Europe. China will do something, but not so much that things spin out of control. And we'll have this kind of kabuki dance to demonstrate, for both sides to demonstrate their toughness. So Europe has made a lot of progress. Their attitudes are shifting in some important ways, but we have some massive questions about implementation and how this is actually going to work and the impact on companies, including US companies, that are in the European market.
Quick follow-up. Semiconductor industry itself, outside of ASML in the Netherlands, Europe is not seen as a central player certainly in the manufacturing end of semiconductors. It supplies lots of materials that are in the supply chain. But I think sort of a devil's advocate question, does Europe even matter in the realm of this kind of high technology?
Well, on semiconductors, I think Europe matters because of ASML. And I think, we talk about specific companies, and I think that you can't think of the industry without that. I think also Europe is a big R&D center. Europe, across technologies, has always had problems going from R&D to the market. And part of that is financial. It has to do with the amount of, how do you get the financing? But part of it is also a lack of channels for creating, a lack of connection between the research facilities and business, except when there is a company like a major chemical or automotive company that is investing internally as opposed to relying on startups coming in with the latest new project. I think Europe, outside of semiconductors, Europe, I'm not sure they're going to be there always will be a huge consumer, and that's important, and key industries there. I think, though, that Europe as a regulatory superpower around the world is influencing the way that companies have to approach their supply chains. And I think the increased emphasis across different supply chains on transparency, monitoring, knowing where every last detail of your components comes from is going to be a very big shift. And Europe is probably going to drive that shift across a variety of technologies.
Great. The last question I was going to ask of Tarun, if he had joined us today, was going to be a forward-looking one, essentially, politely, how does the U.S. political environment affect these policies looking forward? We have some questions online that have come in, one of which is, how do you expect the U.S. approach and potential for transatlantic coordination on the issues we're discussing, how it might shift in a second Biden administration or a second Trump administration? So I'm going to broaden it from just transatlantic cooperation to international cooperation. We're 5 months out. I think it's important that we have enough time to raise this question today, and we can go back to some others in a moment. So who would like to begin on this?
I can start. So since the questioner asked about transatlantic relations, one of the things that I am seeing is that companies are deciding to disaggregate their supply chains. So you'll see investment in China and creating that for the Chinese market. This is European companies. But if they want to do business with the United States, they are leery of assuming that their exports from China will always be able to make it to the United States. And increasingly, will they be able to make it to Europe? And Europe has investigations going on now, not only on EVs, but medical devices and wind turbines and some other things as well. So I think that we are seeing this disaggregation. In terms of US-EU and US-Europe generally, I think we are seeing the Europeans preparing themselves for the reality that they will have to stand more on their own 2 feet on this issue, as well as on a range of security issues. I mean, this all comes as kind of a package. They are, while generally positive on the Biden administration, they are disillusioned by the Biden's trade policy and the failure of the administration to address what they see as a need to reduce some barriers, even really nitpicky ones like a mutual recognition agreement on green goods, the critical minerals accord, so that European batteries will be accepted here under the IRA. So these types of things have made them rather jaundiced already, and most don't really assume that a Biden 2.0 will be much better. They're not thinking, oh, once he gets past the election, it'll be fine. We can restart negotiations on a trade agreement. That's not happening. And they're preparing for that. So Trump, they expect Trump to be even worse if he's in office, but they also expect that to some degree, we, the United States, are heading in this one direction, and no matter which candidate it is, they need to understand and make sure that they're not caught in the middle. Trump will probably be even harder. A Trump presidency will probably be even tougher on China, and they need to be prepared that European companies and European supply chains aren't disrupted by that.
Claire, you want to jump in at this point?
Following up on Francis' comment, I think China is also, I guess, preparing for this by really integrating different ways around the world, so that's not solely dependent on some of the same markets as before. So of course, with Western Europe, as you mentioned, there's semiconductors. There are companies like Augmetic in Finland, that were acquired by a Chinese company, and there are other semiconductor wafer manufacturers as well that are now essentially owned by Chinese companies through the very opaque processes. A lot of supercomputing and a lot of quantum computing in the Nordic countries as well. Of course, Germany, we don't have to get into that. But you also see in Western Europe, there's a shift away from some of these larger projects and towards more consumer commercial technologies, just because of the new screening regulations and the new expanded screening in certain countries. And so focused a lot more on innovation, on what digitalization, on what do they call, like new infrastructure. So everything from blockchain to smart infrastructure in cities and whatnot, and very targeted projects. But then if you kind of move over to, say, the Middle East, which contrasted with Western Europe, is more, it's very wealthy, but still relatively, I think, low talent when it comes to this. China has done, I think, a very clever job of integrating within different countries' national development plans and funding cycles and whatnot. So say Vision 2030 programs in different countries. You're seeing in countries like, again, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, but even countries like Egypt, where China is integrating itself at a very early stage. China is providing equipment, training young government staffers, right, who may be in charge of future procurement decisions. It's very, very sticky, that the way that this is being approached in different places, that I mentioned in parts of Africa as well. So overall, I think China is really prepared for a future where there is greater decoupling from the US and European markets, but they're really looking forward to, again, very wealthy nations and also new emerging markets to make sure that there is a future for Chinese technology and innovation.
Christy, you want to jump in as well? I think you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, okay. So I think most East Asian countries, including Northeast Asian countries and Southeast Asian countries, had not had very pleasant relation with Trump administration, and therefore they have been discussing and also preparing to respond to the election outcome if Trump is coming back. So there have been a lot of discussions here. I think because Trump is a very much trade person, and most of the countries here in this region are actually trade exported economy structure, and therefore they have to be very cautious and they continue to have that kind of trade relations with the U.S. For example, Taiwan, in the past 2 years, we have increased our trade surplus with the U.S., and therefore we have to now review our trade structure and trying to work and try to propose more collaboration with the U.S. in different regards, including more technology collaboration and also more cooperation in terms of AI and all this kind of thing. So I think for Taiwan, we are perhaps in a better position than compared with South Korea or Japan, because for our semiconductor, either Biden or Trump, they will continue to want to work with Taiwan in terms of building up a supply chain, semiconductor supply chain in the U.S. to increase its self-sufficiency. But and therefore, I think that kind of collaboration will not even continue, but may be even enhanced. And there have been discussion here that whether the U.S. industrial policy or the new policies adopted by either Trump or Biden may suck more investment from Taiwan. I don't think that is an issue right now, because even we invest more in terms of semiconductor in the U.S., Taiwan will still continue to be the major location for our chip production. If Arizona operation begin to operate, I think Taiwan, we can still keep around 75 to 80% of chips produced here in Taiwan. So I think Taiwan consider this election as an opportunity to review our policy, and we try to work with both government. And as for South Korea and also for Japan and some Southeast Asian country, I know that they have standing delegations trying to know what Trump's policy will look like if he is coming back to the White House, and I think they are getting prepared for that.
Let me follow up with you with a question I think that fits in nicely from one of our viewers, and this relates to what you were talking about, Taiwan's role in coordinating. The question is that the big computer trade show, Computex 2024, is going on right now in Taiwan, and major tech leaders are discussing the future of AI supply chains, which you referred to a moment ago. And the viewer asked, there seemed to be an increased significance played on the roles that Taiwan could be playing in coordinating the tech supply chain. The specific question is, what role could Taiwan play in helping to coordinate the transatlantic tech supply chain? But I would broaden it out to not just transatlantic, but also trans-Pacific.
Yeah, I missed that because I was here in New Zealand, but I heard that Taiwan right now, because of the Computex, which was the largest in the past 10 years, and we have all these big guys going to Taiwan, including Jason Huang, the co-founder and CEO of NVIDIA. He showed a big picture in his speech, all this ecosystem he has been working with in Taiwan, including large company, small company, lab, and also a university. That means he is actually working with not only TSMC itself, but also a whole bunch of different university and also companies in Taiwan. So there is a complete ecosystem. And with regards to that kind of already very close relation, and Taiwan is definitely going to play a very important role when the whole world is moving towards AI innovation, AI application, and also high-speed computing. I think Taiwan can be a very important role, not only for manufacturing chips, tailor-made chips for all these large companies, but also by jointly cultivating a human resource. For example, right now there are so many interns coming from European countries, including Germany and also UK, trying to have their young people to be trained here in Taiwan, and then go back home to serve their supply chain. I think Taiwan can be a hub to nurture young generation in collaboration with different countries, because we have that kind of atmosphere, that kind of environment. So human talent can be one direction. And also Taiwan has, we don't have that many startup, but I think innovation is one of the strengths that Taiwan has already have. I think we need to cultivate new industry and new technology with the assistance and also with the investment coming from more advanced countries. So manufacturing and also human resource cultivation as well as innovation. I think this will be three directions that Taiwan can work, not only with the US, but also with a lot more European countries. Because in the past few years, we actually have developed a very close business as well as technology collaboration with different European countries. Right now, we have not only upgraded our bilateral consultation level from deputy ministerial to ministerial level, we also have expanded the area for Taiwan-EU collaboration. So for both EU and US will definitely be two of the major partners that we can continue to work with.
Thank you for that. Claire, I wanted to ask you a question about China's semiconductor industry. There's been massive investment in semiconductor factories, fabs, in the last few years. Multiple fabs are opening just this year alone. And most of these are older generation, so-called legacy chips. This has actually become an issue that's raised a lot of concern in Washington in terms of the degree to which the U.S. may end up becoming more dependent on Chinese chips going forward. Of course, during the shortages that took place at the end of COVID, many of the chips that were unavailable were these older chips. And I'm curious what perspective you might be able to offer on this issue, and particularly how Beijing itself may be looking at it.
Yeah, I think Beijing right now is trying to buy whatever it can and manufacture whatever it can, especially in light of potential expanded sanctions and export controls in the future. But it's also tricky because Taiwan and China still have a very interconnected sort of thread when it comes to the semiconductor industry, when it comes to the talent, it comes to, everything from the folks working in quality control to engineering and whatnot, all the way to the supply chain. And so, I think that even as China begins or continues to expand on its own semiconductor capabilities, it's going to be difficult, remains difficult to kind of extract China from supply chains while continuously importing from Taiwan. And this is something that maybe perhaps Christy can speak a little bit more to as well. But I think until Taiwan and China, I think, continue to move in more parallel directions, China is going to be in the U.S. supply chains, I think, in a very prominent way for a while. And so we're going to have to prepare for this as U.S. continues to indigenize development.
And I think that really gets to the issue that I would have raised with Tarun of the degree to which you can untangle these supply chains that have grown up over a period of 30 years without any real concern about political risk. Christy, did you want to add anything to what Claire just said?
Yes, but first of all, I think I understand there is always different interpretation or comments on what the de-risking strategy means, because it's different for EU as well as the US. But here in Taiwan, because we are export-oriented and we have so small a market, and therefore we have to explore all these major markets in the world. So de-risking meaning in Taiwan mainly diversification. Not only diversification of the markets, of the trade partnership, but also diversification of the production base. And that's the background for Taiwan now export more to other parts of the world than China. And also that means that we now have supply chain going to different places. It's not decoupling. It's actually diversification, expanded their operations from China to other parts of the world. So I agree with Claire that we still have very close relation with China, and there is no way that all this supply chain already in China can be easily moved out or closed. And therefore, for all these supply chains still in China, they will continue to do business with China. But in the meantime, they will be very, very cautious and trying to protect for example, our technology, our IP, our trade secret, and also be more giving more attention to this geopolitical tension. Because right now, if you are too close with China, and sometimes your opportunity working with Western countries or Western companies may be undermined. So I think Taiwan company as well as a government trying to keep a balance while we continue to think China is a very important market, but on the other hand, we do want to work more and want to do more business with the other parts of the world because we are like-minded country and for all this country, because right now they all have their strategy trying to develop their own supply chain, and Taiwan can definitely play a very important role in that.
Fran, I've got a question for you from a viewer. You said you predicted a toughening of Europe's policies towards China, but carefully negotiated so it doesn't, quote unquote, blow up in their faces. Right. So the question is, what does that look like? And is Europe overestimating how much retaliation China could or would actually impose on the EU as a bloc?
Overestimating.
It does say over, yes.
Overestimating. I think that the EU is going to continue to have a very important economic relationship with China. We will continue to see a lot of investment by European companies in China and significant Chinese investment in certain areas in Europe. And there will continue to be a lot of trade, but I do think we're seeing this executives saying, am I in the area that poses a risk? And not only a risk of what China might do, but what the United States might do to China that will have, I become the secondary victim, right? So I think that is something that Europe will have to navigate, and I think they are starting to navigate it. I also think we'll see Europe be more outspoken and aggressive, that might not be the right word, but looking at these investigations, now that they've given themselves the power to do these investigations rather than relying on the WTO, these investigations can become very political. And that's what I think we're seeing in terms of China right now, sometimes saying that they're going to do a lot of investing and other times saying, well, we're going to retaliate. I mean, so this is kind of a good cop, bad cop from one actor. I do think that there is a big question that both the US and Europe needs to answer, and that is, where does the definition of strategic end? We were just talking about legacy chips, right? And just boring normal chips. And at the last US-EU TTC, Trade and Technology Council, there was a discussion on chips, and not just the high-powered, high-tech ones, but you can't build a car or a washing machine or anything without regular chips. Do those become strategic because your whole industry, a major backbone of your economy, is about to collapse because it can't get the chips it needs? So how far out does this go? And I think that that's the question that we don't know. And so for Europe, I think the challenges are, how do we have to do this ourselves? We thought, Europe thinks that it would be better to do it with like-minded countries, with the United States, but as well as Japan, Korea, and Taiwan increasingly. But how do you do that if everyone is also focused on their own domestic economy, right? And also, where are the boundaries? Are things that we didn't think are going to be strategic, are they going to be strategic in 5 years? What do you do if it's not just chips, but it's green technologies that are going to help your society transition into a new type of economy? So those are the questions that I think that Europe is going to have to deal with.
Excellent. We've got a few more minutes, so I'm going to ask if everybody would like to sort of wrap up with final observations. Christy, why don't we start with you? Is there anything you would like to add, either big picture, or if you think there's something that we've not adequately addressed, this is your chance.
Okay, I'll start with the semiconductor supply chain, which is right now a very important issue. I think in Taiwan, we are happy to see the beginning of Taiwan semiconductor supply chain, or moving from Taiwan to a more advanced country, going to TSMC, UMC, another company which is called PSMC. Now they move to Singapore. They have new fabs in Japan, and TSMC right now in the U.S., and they are going to Germany next year, and they are also bringing suppliers with them. So that means that the semiconductor supply chain, actually for the first time in the past 4 decades, now going out and more globalized. So people here argue that is this a hollowing out of our semiconductor supply chain? But I think the answer is no, because in Taiwan we do have electricity issue, we have water issue, and therefore we need to have more. We need to have different environment to accommodate the growth of this of TSMC and also other suppliers. So moving to different places and working with their government will maintain a closer relation between Taiwan and all this government. So after all, we need all this government to support Taiwan, not only for economy, but also for defense and also for security in the future. So I think that is a very good beginning. However, I do want to remind friends in the U.S. and also in EU, because right now we see TSMC right now building up their fab. But if you consider the whole supply chain or the ecosystem, you still need to have test and packaging, for example. But right now there's no capacity yet for advanced chip in the U.S. and also for TSMC going to build a fab in Germany, they also need to have test and packaging, that kind of capacity. So we still have a long way to go to make sure that the supply chain can work in these different countries. Only have fabrication will never be enough. Therefore, we need to see continuous support from local government as well as from Taiwan, so that they can have the IC design, they can have the fabrication, they can have testing and packaging as well as application, and that's what we call this ecosystem developed in different countries.
Thank you very, very much, Claire.
Absolutely. And along with working with our allies and partners too, the United States, we have made a lot of demands of European partners, right? And there is, I think, maybe sometimes in some pockets, a growing, I don't know, I'd say resentment, but a feeling that some countries are being pulled around by the U.S. and not necessarily seeing any sort of or sufficient support to mitigate the economic hardships or the other burdens incurred by those countries as they work with the U.S. and as they work closer. So, for example, we have countries like, and this is kind of adjacent to supply chain, like Italy, that have left the Belt and Road. That was a decision I think the U.S. had really urged. But the U.S., that was also partially because Italy wasn't really seeing some of the benefits promised by China, the Belt and Road. But Italy also hasn't really seen some of the benefits that were kind of, insinuated by the U.S. When they left. And we also have countries like, for example, I think it's Romania that agreed with the U.S. on an MOU, right, to I think divest Huawei or to ban Huawei from its telecommunications networks. But at the same time, it's still signing licenses or granting licenses to companies like Lenovo, and in part because they still need these equipments and kind of these operators and these vendors, and there aren't really great alternatives just yet. So I think, again, thinking more about as we make these requests of allies, and to, again, expand screening capabilities and to pull away from China, that the U.S. is also thinking with more constructive and I guess, development-minded solutions as well to work together, and also just to look but in addition to Western Europe and Eastern Europe, also again looking to the Middle East, to North and Sub-Saharan Africa, and to a lot of other markets with vast workforces that are increasingly entering this space and are rapidly digitalizing, and not to kind of forget, I guess, the so-called global South when it comes to tech supply chains and when it comes to building more resilient tech innovation ecosystem as well. I think that absolutely needs to be a part of the picture, and that's something China is incredibly cognizant of, and I'm not sure if the U.S. is, or at least publicly, quite as much yet. Thanks.
Fran, we're kind of running out of time. Do you want to add anything to your sort of what was, I thought, a very nice capstone at a moment ago?
I think that we just need to, over the next few years, look at what business is doing in response to what government has laid out. Both in the US and Europe, we've provided subsidies and incentives. Business is taking advantage of those and seems to be in the initial phase of de-risking the supply chains. Is government continuing to encourage that, and particularly encourage it in a way where it's not just national? It's not just the US, it's not just the EU, but how do we figure out how to do this together? And I know that a lot of people in think tanks and observers are thinking about how do we create climate clubs, CHIPS clubs, and things like this across national boundaries for countries that share similar values. And I think that's going to be the big challenge of the next few years.
Great. Real quick closing thought. This is essentially our second big trade discussion this week here at the Atlantic Council. On Monday, U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai joined us. There was a lot of discussion of the transatlantic relationship. There was a lot of discussion of the 80th anniversary of both the Bretton Woods institutions and the D-Day invasion, which would be 40 years tomorrow. As we leave, I'd just like to ask people to remember another anniversary, which was 35 years ago. This week was the Tiananmen crackdown, just as germane to our discussion as anything else we've been talking about from history. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us here and from afar. I'd like to thank Christy in particular for staying up very late in New Zealand to offer extraordinarily cogent remarks as always, but particularly given the hour. I'd like to thank Fran and Claire for joining us and everybody for all your work putting this together. And we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.